Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, September 19th, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about President Donald Trump's presidential campaign and the race to be his vice president. Now, with Kristi Noem's endorsement, the governor of South Dakota recently endorsed him just a few days ago in the South Dakota state rally that Donald Trump held. There's been a lot of consideration around whether or not she is going to be his vice president. Now, the emphasis comes here on the word she. Donald Trump, who the Democratic Party has spent a very long time trying to brandish as a sexist, as someone who is anti-women, anti-women's policies, now seems to be actively considering choosing a woman as his vice president. Now, this comes as a bit of a contrast to Vice President Mike Pence from the last election, 2016 and 2020, in which he served as his running mate. It's very obvious this time around that Donald Trump will not be considering him again. But Kristi Noem, amongst many others, start to build this trend around Donald Trump feeding into this concept that he might be choosing a woman as vice president. Now, for a while now, there has been a lot of conversation around who Donald Trump is going to pick, who he trusts the most, and who he wants to be his vice president. Now, Axios did this scoop back in March of 2023, saying that Kari Lake was amongst 4 women Donald Trump was considering for his vice presidential pick. Kari Lake, if you remember her, she ran for governor back in 2022, actively considering a Senate bid in Arizona, according to sources closest to her, and of course, her own travel, history, meeting with many senators, having those open and candid conversations. But she isn't the only one, as Axios reports. There also is a conversation around Nikki Haley, the candidate who is running against Donald Trump in the GOP primary. More on her later in the video. Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders, also more on her later in the video. And Governor Kristi Noem, who we have already mentioned, with a lot of speculation around whether or not Donald Trump is going to pick her. Now, a lot of the speculation, too, was fueled largely by this rally when Donald Trump's campaign put forth this TV screen that showed Trump and Noem on the same screen together. It was a bit of a different type of campaign strategy that we hadn't really seen prior to, where it was almost as if Donald Trump was testing the waters or making an early indication as to what type of possibility there could be for the 2024 presidential race. Now, this TV screen was only up briefly, literally for moments at a time. But generally speaking, I mean, Donald Trump has been very, very open in the conversation now of choosing a woman as vice president, but saying he doesn't think too much about it. He seems to be balancing his idea of choosing somebody different, choosing somebody out in the fray who could combat a lot of the challenges the Democrats are going to give him, challenges surrounding the issue of abortion and women's rights and women's equity. And he knows that that makes sense to choose a woman as VP to already sort of combat those challenges and notions. And he knows that there are right and wrong candidates to do so. He knows that there is a right way to go down the line, but the question is, who does he want to run with? I think there is a very obvious choice when it comes down to who the most electable Republican woman would be. In my opinion, that is Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador and former governor of South Carolina, who in consistent polling seems to be defeating Joe Biden by larger margins than any other Republican contender on the ballot today, including President Donald Trump. However, she has been very critical of Donald Trump, which means, there is a lot of consideration, too, that she will not be in the VP running. Some people closest to Donald Trump believe that he values loyalty above everything. He values these endorsements above anything. And Nikki Haley, who once promised that she would not run against Donald Trump should he decide to pursue a re-election bid for the presidency, is now actively campaigning against him. She got on the campaign stage, called him out by name, and when questioned about the VP speculation, saying that she doesn't run for second, that she isn't in this race to be his VP. Times can change, though. People say this all the time. We remember that Vice President Kamala Harris was one of the biggest critics of President Joe Biden when he was running as vice president in the 2019 timeframe for the Democratic primaries. I think we might all remember her rise to popularity in the Democratic primary really came when she went after Joe Biden and peeled away a significant chunk of his support. Eventually, though, came around, endorsed him in the primary, then went on to be obviously his vice president. So this is not to say that this is the end of Nikki Haley's campaign. That's why I'm still covering her on this topic. But it's very interesting, I think, at the very least, that Donald Trump is in fact considering a woman to be his vice president, because I think it is, politically speaking, the right move. And considering that Democrats have already accomplished the question and the accomplishment of having the first woman vice president, it would only make sense for Donald Trump to replicate that, except this time on the Republican side. Now, Donald Trump saying that he doesn't think too much about it too doesn't mean that this isn't going to happen. I think Donald Trump has very much been set in stone that he isn't choosing Mike Pence, and there are practically no other heavy hitters on this entire ballot except for, quite honestly, Nikki Haley. We can see here that Governor Ron DeSantis is trailing in these polls, fading in support amongst the GOP electorate, and eventually he's not going to be as politically relevant. Now, he certainly is more politically relevant on the GOP side than any other candidate besides Donald Trump, but he is not this candidate who's coming in with a significant chunk of support that Donald Trump would need to leverage in the general election. The good news about this is that he has a pretty clear 50% plus threshold in every single poll that has been released that tells us that he has the majority of Republican support, regardless of the source you're looking at. The only one out of the ordinary here is Rasmussen Reports, which is quite fitting. You can see that Donald Trump, at a bare minimum in our polling, is at 45%, which, get this, was higher than where he was by the end of the 2016 race, give or take a few points. So that, for one, shows us that Donald Trump's lead right now is insurmountable. He will be the GOP nominee unless there is some divine intervention by the court systems, by any type of legal procedure that might disqualify him from the election. There are things that could happen. The question is, will they? And I honestly give them a less than 2% chance of happening at this point in time. So that's why we are talking about the Veep stakes. I know that we are not even into the Iowa caucuses. Those are 4 months away. Crazy to think about. But we are talking about this for a reason, because it absolutely matters. And again, Democrats got that first in 2020. But Republicans need to combat the notion that Donald Trump is a sexist. The Republican Party needs to combat the notion that Donald Trump and the GOP is anti-women. And the best way to do that is by taking someone who Democrats have vilified, characterized as a sexist, platformed all of his comments surrounding women in the past, and painted him out to be this one person who was not supportive of women in this country, of women in politics. And it would be a very big move for him to choose a woman, specifically someone as well recognized as Nikki Haley, as well recognized as Kristi Noem. Now, I look at the presidential race too from the lens of electability, right? As does Donald Trump, as do Democrats, as does anybody involved in this presidential race. That's not news. But what is news is whether or not these Republicans will impact the election in a positive way, whether or not these VP contenders will be a benefit or a detriment. My general takeaway here is that in almost any situation where Donald Trump chooses somebody like Kristi Noem or Nikki Haley, it probably will have a marginal bump or a negligible impact on the election. But there are some candidates I do think do weigh him down in the event he decides to choose them. I said I would talk about Kari Lake and Sarah Huckabee Sanders a little bit later in the video, and I'm going to do exactly that. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who served as his press secretary, now serving as the governor of Arkansas, and then, of course, Kari Lake, who was a TV anchor, ran for governor in the state of Arizona, refused to concede the election result, and has made a name for himself, but not necessarily in the best way. Those two contenders, I don't know if they add to Donald Trump's ticket. I think he does move in the right direction by choosing a woman in the first place. I think it's time the Republicans have nominated someone beyond Sarah Palin to be that VP nominee who would make history as the first Republican woman elected. I think that at the baseline should be good. But there are candidates, again, that even with that as a factor, way down the top of the ticket. Even though Donald Trump, I think, does a lot of damage to himself, as we've seen Nikki Haley and some other Republicans outpacing Donald Trump nationally, they can add an additional benefit. But Kari Lake and Sarah Huckabee Sanders simply just don't have that. Now, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, though she is serving as the governor of Arkansas, I think for a lot of America, they perceive her in a comedic type of fashion. She was ridiculed, she was attacked, she was vilified throughout her time as press secretary for some of the more unorthodox and alternative facts that she used during her time as the press secretary for the White House. She did not garner the best reputation, and I do believe there is a lot that could be used against her, considering she was the spokesperson for the Trump White House. The thing for Kari Lake is that she's an election denier. Yes, Donald Trump is too, but she isn't backed by as many institutional Republicans. In fact, barely is backed by any Republicans whatsoever. In addition to that, she does hail from the state of Arizona, which might seem to be an added benefit, but there's a reason she lost in a national environment that was about 8 points more Republican than when Donald Trump lost by 0.3. It's all about this idea of, what is our point of comparison? Donald Trump might think maybe she could add an additional Arizona benefit. But again, keep in mind that the circumstances of that election were entirely different than they were in 2020. You had Republicans winning the popular vote by 3 in 2022. Democrats won it in 2020 by 5 points. And yet somehow Democrats doubled their margin in 2022 against Carrie Lake. The voters rejected her in Arizona, and I honestly think she would weigh him down in Arizona. There wouldn't be an added swing state, home state benefit. It would be a detriment. It would lose him the state of Arizona if he wasn't already going to lose it himself. There are clearly two good options for Donald Trump and two bad options. I think the best option by far is Nikki Haley, and then you drop down quite a bit into the consideration around Governor Kristi Noem. My concern with her, as someone looking at it from the electoral lens, is that she was way more anti-COVID than Donald Trump. And I know we like to think that America doesn't care about COVID-19, but Democrats and messaging strategies can make people care again. In the event there is another pandemic, there are going to be very many major concerns raised about how Kristi Noem handled it in South Dakota. She never once closed down the state, never once enforced any mandates. She kept the state normal. And for Republicans, that might be positive. But for independent voters and Democrats that were aligned with the CDC on COVID guidance, on COVID vaccines, the majority of the nation that got the vaccine to save themselves, to protect themselves from the virus. I mean, there are people out there that still remember how they felt during lockdown for sure. But Kristi Noem coming in at the stark contrast when Donald Trump is already going to be coming in with Democrats attacking him for his handling of COVID-19. A lot of the same things that played in 2020 may not be as effective in 2024, but they certainly will still matter because voters cared about it before and they can care about it again. Democrats have not ramped up their strategy against Donald Trump to the extent that we will see in full force come next summer and fall of 2024. Democrats are laying low. Kristi Noem hasn't been extensively vetted to the extent that any other contender on this stage has been. Democrats are aligning their focus on the GOP primary, but Kristi Noem in specific, in the event she is that VP nominee, I think has a lot more baggage than Nikki Haley does as the former governor of South Carolina, as the former UN ambassador, because she has played her cards correctly. The only downside for her is this question and issue of loyalty. Does Donald Trump take someone who says they don't run for second? Do Democrats use this as a means of going against a Trump-Haley ticket? Though, Republicans tried it with Kamala Harris's attacks on Joe Biden, tried to use her own words to paint Joe Biden as this candidate who was, not supportive of the black community, not supportive of minorities in America, not for America. Republicans certainly tried it, but obviously it did not work out. But considering how close this election is expected to be, every single thing matters. Although Joe Biden may be disapproved of nationwide by a margin of roughly 13 points, double digits, worse than Obama, worse than Trump, he still is in a good position when it comes down to the general election. And beyond this point, the statewide polls are also a lot better. And the betting odds here don't exactly indicate the Democrats are going to lose the presidential race. We even see that it's about 58 cents for a Democratic share, 45 for a Republican share. And that's because there's new numbers that come out of states like Michigan that show Joe Biden up by 3. Numbers that come out of states like Pennsylvania that show Biden up by 2. In some cases, either matching the margin from 2020 or even expanding on them. And looking back at 2022, there are things to consider as well that tell us Democrats significantly outperformed what polling was suggesting. Democrats did much better in the swing states of Michigan, in the swing states of Pennsylvania. And I wish you could see me right now because I'm putting swing states in air quotes because that's not how they ended up, even if the polls had suggested it at that point in time. So there's a lot that really impacts polling, impacts the elections. I really do want to see, in the future, how correct these polls actually end up being this far out in advance. Because they do suggest a very, very competitive race. And I'm not doubting that it's going to be competitive. But I think that where we are right now, Donald Trump needs a slam dunk VP nominee. And he's making the right decision and exploring this possibility of choosing a woman as vice president. I think many conservatives have taken the reactionary stance when asked this question. I'm going to choose the most qualified person. He said this, but that's their takeaway. They're not saying they like the concept. They're not saying they're willing to explore the concept. They always say, we don't do diversity hires. We are going to choose the most qualified candidate. It's coded language to say They don't want to choose a woman as vice president. They don't want to choose a minority as vice president. And that's the way that this issue has been approached in years past, not only for the vice presidency, but also for Senate nominations, right? Come down to district judges, Supreme Court judges. You see it being weaponized and used against Democrats with Ketanji Brown Jackson, with Kamala Harris. Very clearly coded arguments, coded language surrounding misogynoir and, a lot of other extending factors that impact Republican politics. But Donald Trump isn't playing into it. And that's the first step in the right direction, I think, for an electable candidate, for an electable campaign too. And looking at how close the presidential race is, I do think this could make a difference. But there are some candidates that strike out to me as bad picks for Donald Trump as VP, and some very good ones as well. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.